You're listening to Wildlife Control Consultant, where we provide research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest management. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast, where we cover all things related to wildlife control from a technical and research-based perspective. Hey, glad to have you on board. I hope you had a great week. Yes, I am still in trying to dig out of my business, but I'm working on it. I'm hopefully seeing the light of day, but I trust that you are also in the busy season now, and perhaps some of you take a little bit of a break during the July period, which is certainly when this podcast will be going into the offing here. So anyways, we'd love to have you subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, and if you have questions, comments, you can put them into the comments below, or you can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear your thoughts. Perhaps you have suggestions for different shows, or maybe you have a question and a criticism. Yes, we'll take that as well. If you'd like to be on the show, we'd love to talk to you about being on the club. We love having guests. You can reach me, of course, at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Do take a few moments, if you would, though, is to familiarize yourself with the podcast. I do have a podcast that out. Actually, it just published here at the end of June. Today, in fact, which would be June 27th, should have dropped at YouTube, which will discuss for you elements about what it would take for what the interview process is and what you should expect. Just to try to save some time, I am quite busy and I don't have, unfortunately, a lot of time to do back and forth with you. Either you'd like to be on the show or you're not, or you wouldn't, right? So a lot of the questions that you may have will be answered there. I don't want to put a barrier up, but we would love to have people. We welcome people on our show, and we think we treat them well, but a lot of people, unfortunately, seem to be afraid. But so it is what it is. Nevertheless, you can reach out to me, of course. This week, we are going to be talking about dealing with loafing bats, given the fact that when we're having pups during the summer, of course, and many of you may be dealing with bats, this is something that would certainly be useful for people that are just homeowners, but also you in the business world as well. Perhaps you may be looking for tips to give people on how to get rid of loafing bats. But before we get into that, of course, we'd love to have you introduce you to my website, wildlifecontrolconsultant.com. And of course, we have a variety of things for sale here. You can see my publications on a variety of things, and also some of the services I provide. I do provide services well in terms of helping people with their PowerPoints and the presentation. If perhaps you've been asked to speak at a trade event and want to polish up your PowerPoint, a lot of people don't understand how to make PowerPoints well, and so we can certainly help polish that up for you. But definitely reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. All right, enough of all that. Why don't we get started on the topic of today? Let me pull up my PowerPoint here. I sometimes just throw these together really quickly just to help keep me outlined. So to keep me on focus there. There we go. So we're going to be dealing, of course, with loafing bats. So let's talk about some definitions, okay? So we want to be sure we're separating out loafing from roosting. And so generally speaking, these aren't technical definitions, but I want to be sure you understand how I'm using the words, right? I'm not putting them out here that, these are the official scientific definitions. I'm not suggesting that. I want to be clear about how I am using the terms, right? So when I'm referring to a loafing bat, it's basically a bat that is just sort of hanging out, right? So it's maybe gone on a hunting run, and it needs to sort of rest, digest its food, get its energy back before it goes hunting again. Where a roosting bat is something we would want to use in terms of that this is where it's living, right? It's sort of the difference between sleeping in your bed versus taking a nap on the couch, right? So the bed would be your roosting area, and the couch would be your loafing area, if that helps, okay? So the difference is, of course, is that bats in loafing situations are going to be on the exterior of the building. And you may say, well, what's the big deal? Well, many people can get quite panicky when they see a bat up against their house, especially when they're coming home maybe in the darkness and they have a light there and all of a sudden they see a bat and perhaps the bat gets spooked and flies away. And that can frighten people. There, a lot of people struggle with various phobias with wildlife, and of course, bats are associated with Halloween and evil and this sort of thing, and so that can be quite stressful for people. And so that can be something where keeping that bat from loafing there can be very important for their own personal psychological well-being and sometimes even their physical well-being, because if they get too startled, sometimes people slip and fall. I was aware of a case where someone was walking to a restaurant, for example, and birds startled her as she was walking the building because they flew out of a a bush that was on the way walking to the restaurant. She fell over and hurt herself. So something certainly like that could happen with a bat, especially when we're looking at night. So nevertheless, we want to be sure we're clear that loafing would be different from roosting. So we're not dealing with bats that are living on the premises. Now, I do want to make one further caveat in that sometimes when we're dealing with migratory bats, that is bats, usually this would occur more toward the fall season. Bats may be leaving their normal hunting grounds, leaving their normal maternity roosts and locations during the summer, and then they're migrating south to get out of the colder weather and maybe finally find their way to their cave or what have you. And that sometimes bats, when they're making these journeys, do hang on buildings on the exterior just to sort of have an overnight sleep, maybe for a day, get some pick up some bugs, get some energy, and then continue their migratory journey south. Even though that would be a case where they're kind of more roosting, those are very temporary situations, and in a couple of days the bats are typically gone. So I'm not really referring to those in that situation. Likewise, if you're dealing with a place where someone has excluded bats from a structure, and perhaps they did it too soon, and the bats, the females are hanging around the roost because their young is still inside, that also is not something I'm referring to as a roosting behavior. Okay, so it could be technically roosting, but it's certainly not loafing, right? So I want to be sure we're clear about that. So we're dealing with a situation where bats are simply needing a place to hang out, to rest a little bit in between their hunting forays. It's not a place that they are made a permanent residence for. They may use it repeatedly, but it's just their couch spot, not their bed spot. All right, I hope I've made that clear. So before we go too much further, of course, we want to talk about bats. Bats may have legal protections. There is a lot of mythology in America where a lot of people think that bats are protected throughout the country, and that is simply not true, at least at this time. There is at least one state that does not offer any protections for bats unless it's protected by the federal government, like for an endangered or threatened species, for example. So not every state has protections, but nevertheless, we do want to be careful with bats because many of their populations are under tremendous strain. And bats don't reproduce very aggressively. They're not like mice. Therefore, harm that comes to bats, harm to a colony of bats, for example, can have devastating consequences for years because they're such long-lived animals. They're so small and they can live for a very long time. So it's important for us, even if it's legal to harm them, we want to try to reduce that as much as possible and resolve these conflicts because of white nose syndrome is certainly a threat. And then, of course, our changing of the habitat that many bats rely on to survive. And so we want to be sure that whatever we're doing to disturb their behavior that we're not comfortable with, we want to be sure that we're doing that in a manner that is the least aggressive necessary to solve the problem. Certainly, we don't want to be killing bats in this situation because I don't think it's really necessary in these situations, unless, of course, there's been some sort of an exposure, which would be highly, highly unusual. So, nevertheless, consult your state wildlife agency to see if there are any regulations on the handling or disturbance of bats in the situation that we're calling loafing. That is a bat that's just simply hanging out on the exterior of your building, and they're just resting there. So make sure you find out before you do anything rash. So what we're looking, first of all, when you have a bat situation where bats are sort of loafing on the exterior of your house, is that you can simply frighten them. And you can just simply say, well, let's find out if they're going to come back. And how would you convince the bat to leave? Well, a very simple way of doing that is to take a spitzer bottle and just squirt them lightly, not aggressively. Don't have a stream with, moving at 40 miles an hour at them. Just a spitzer, a little spray bottle. Try to get a little distance to it. You don't want to get too close to them. And just spray them with a little bit of water, and the bats will fly away. Be careful how you position yourself, right? So think about, where is the bat going to be flying to? So if you're standing in the entranceway and then spraying the bat, don't be shocked if the bat's flying at you, because he's got to come towards you to get out of the area. It could be a doorway, hallway. So think about making sure you are not in the way of the bat. The bat knows how to get in and out of that area. So make sure you're not in his way, because that can be quite startling, and you might reach out and try to protect yourself and strike the bat, and that can maybe result in an exposure or a bite, which you don't want to do. So plan what you're doing very carefully. Have your spitzer bottle, get an idea how far it will spray. And if the bat can fly to your right, then you want to be over to the left and spray it at an angle so that the bat goes in the opposite direction. Okay, think about this. You notice here's my diagram. So notice the person's over on the left side. I'm going to spray the bat so the bat will leave to... I'm looking at it as the right. I'm hoping you're seeing it the same way. I've got to think about how that's viewed by your side. But nevertheless, I hope you get the idea. Think about how the bat is going to make his escape. If water is not appropriate, then maybe you can take a little broom, perhaps, and just lightly reach up toward it. Sometimes you don't even have to touch the bat. Maybe just a little tap against the building. That vibration may be enough, if you're close enough, to get the bat to move. And then don't handle the end of that. Let things thoroughly dry, although there would be likely no rabies exposure there. Okay, but just have a plan. This is not an emergency. Just work your way through the process, but something very, very simple that won't harm the bats. Now, in other situations, you may need to do a little bit more. For example, perhaps the bats are hanging out behind your shutters or in your attic vents. Now, sometimes that occurs because the bats are actually roosting there. Other times, they may be just using it as a location for them to loaf because they feel a little bit more protected. You need to kind of get an idea of which is which. For example, you may have a situation where bats are on the exterior of your attic vent screen because they're just hot and they're wanting to get a little cooler, but they're actually living in your house. If you have any questions on that, you're going to probably need to get a hold of a professional or do a bat inspection, because the last thing you want to do in the attic vent situation is to screen that exterior vent with 1/4-inch hardware cloth and then trap bats inside because you thought they were gone or they weren't using the attic when in fact they were using the attic. And that shouldn't be the case anytime you're dealing with an exclusion. You want to make sure that the bats have left and that there's no young behind, right? It's very, very important. And that can be difficult. Sometimes it's a timing issue. This podcast is not about excluding bats from your home that are living there. This is about loafing bats. But nevertheless, I want to just make sure I put this caveat out there. When you're dealing with an exclusion situation, you want to make sure that the bats weren't able to get into the building. That can be rather difficult, particularly for people that are not professionals. I'm going to recommend you consult with a professional, or you have enough courage and detail to make sure you're checking that attic vent screen to see if there were any gaps in it. Sometimes the bats can push against it and then drop in behind it. That can be very difficult to see unless you're up close and personal. And that brings us into all kinds of safety issues when we're dealing with bats, and that's not what this podcast today is about. Now, as far as shutters is concerned, one way you can handle when bats are loafing behind your shutters is simply remove the shutter. Right, so that's certainly something that you can do. Or don't forget that sometimes a little bit of tolerance goes a long ways. Is the bat really doing all that much damage if it's hanging out behind your shutter, for example? Is it really that big of a deal? Again, you want to make sure that bats are not living in your house, and by that I mean that they are able to penetrate the exterior of the building. Once they penetrate the exterior of the building, then the bats are living in the structure, right? I'm talking about loafing bats where they have not penetrated the exterior of the structure. But sometimes when we have a situation with loafing bats, let's say behind a shutter, do you really need to do all that much? Because it's not going to last all winter typically. At least I'm not aware of it occurring that way in North America. Maybe in Mexico it might be an issue. But in terms of the United States, I have not heard of it being an issue. Definitely put some comments in below this podcast if you've had some experience, or reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. But as a general rule, sometimes in those types of situations, you can just let it go. And if the droppings become an issue, a little bit of a garden hose can wash some of those droppings away. And so there is a thing, sometimes just let it be, or as I call it, give peace a chance. Okay. But if not, then there are ways of handling that even behind your shutters. And that's where we get to our next slide. And that is, there used to be a product that was sold that was basically, how do I describe it? It wasn't styrofoam, but it had a styrofoam-like nature to it, but it was a little bit more durable than styrofoam. Certainly plastic, and it was designed so that it could fit behind your shutters, and then carefully to prevent bats from getting in behind it. So you would install this behind your gutters to prevent bats from being able to sneak in behind it. There are other products today. I don't think this particular one is still available. When I checked, I didn't find it at the distributor. I saw it before it, but they have other materials. Typically, there's sort of a plastic type of sponge type material that you can wedge behind your shutter in a way that it wouldn't be visible to the public, but it would still keep bats from being able to get in behind your shutter. Just make sure there are no bats there before you again do this type of exclusion work. Now, if bats are hanging out under a covered porch, for example, or perhaps a covered doorway, one way to stop that from occurring, of course, is simply screen it off, right? So if you have an open porchway, screen it off. The bats can't loaf where they can't reach, right? So that's a very simple thing to do. And it will also keep a lot of the insects away as well. I didn't mention this already. One thing that you can do to help reduce the attractiveness of your property to bats, and that is to convert some of your exterior lighting to the more yellow-based lighting, which doesn't attract bugs as aggressively as our white light based lights. So that can also be a tool in you to try to reduce the attractiveness of the area, because if bats are not attract to your building because they're trying to hunt the bugs, then they're maybe going to be less likely to need to loaf there because they're not hunting near your particular building. So that's something for you to consider as well. Now, another way, but if you have a situation where bats are loafing in a particular spot, how can we get rid of them? Well, one of the ways is just get yourself a sort of a bright light and illuminate the spot where the bat is loafing. Very simple to do, very easy, very low cost, and something that you can then turn off when the bats leave, because you're probably convinced that it's no longer a good place to leave. It may take a few days for it to fully work, but it's something certainly. But you want a good bright light and really shine it on the location where the bats, because typically they're going to loaf in an area that it may be lit a little bit, but it's going to be darker, a darker portion, and typically don't want to be right near where light is per se, because that can certainly annoy them. You can also use a motion activated toy. This is something that we use for that I recommend for woodpeckers, but you can simply hang this over the spot where bats have been loafing, and then when a bat comes in to roost, the sensor on it realizes there's something there, and then it kind of moves down. And that may be something for you to try. It's relatively cheap. I think these things cost $15, $20. And that may be something for you to try. It doesn't matter whether it's a spider or not. The idea is just you want something that's going to activate when it has motion in front of it and then move down, and to just frighten the bat away to move to a different location. There is also a ultrasonic situation where typically I don't recommend ultrasound for much of anything. However, there have been some what we call white paper type reports or anecdotal reports about the role of ultrasound as a way to irritate a bat that's loafing at a particular spot. Now, the ultrasound needs to be strong enough, and you want to direct it right at the spot where the bats are loafing. And of course, bats can hear in the ultrasonic range. And of course, the idea is it's sort of like blasting heavy metal music at your neighbor, So he can hear it. He doesn't like to hear it in the middle of the night. And so this is basically a way to irritate the bat and force him to move to a location that's going to be quieter for him. Now, the research was done back in the 70s, and there was another piece of research done in 2011. These were typically in locations where bats were living rather than loafing. But the principle was the same, and there did seem to be either interfering with the bat's ability to land safely, or bats' ability to roost in a particular area. So if they're having trouble roosting in a spot, they don't want to loaf there, of course, either. Now, understand, ultrasound is a very weak sound. It's not going to go around corners. It doesn't travel very far. So you want to be sure you're positioning the ultrasound in close proximity. It doesn't have to be right on the bat, right? But we're looking at, you don't want to be putting it out 20 feet away, okay? You want to try to get it as close as possible. So there are some that are portable that are using, like D batteries or C or D cell batteries. And one called the Yard Guard from BirdX is something you may want to consider. I am not being paid to endorse this particular product. In fact, I'm not even endorsing it, so please don't take it as that. I'm just kind of giving you an idea of something that could work for you. I do not recommend that you purchase any ultrasonic devices unless you're very confident about the return agreement, right? So, because if it doesn't work for you, you want to be able to be sure you can return it back. But I have heard from a wildlife control professional who used a more aggressive version. This one that I've mentioned here is about $70. He was using one that was in the $500 or $600 range, and he said it worked for him. Again, we don't have a huge sample size on this, but it's certainly a relatively low-tech idea, and it's something that may work for you. And $70 is not a big cost. And bats do hear in the ultrasonic range, and so it's reasonable to think that this could be irritating enough for them to simply pick a different area to loaf at. And then my last suggestion for you was one I learned from a bat biologist in Canada, and she suggested plexiglass. And the idea being is that bats can't grip it. So if bats can't grip the surface, they can't loaf. So if they're at a particular spot on your building, then just simply applying some plexiglass to that location prevents the bat from getting grip. And so where he can't grip, he can't loaf. Rather clever idea. So maybe something for you to try on that. Well, I hope you found these suggestions helpful, because this is a relatively simple issue. It's not something that's gonna, that should be crushing for clients. But it can be something where you have some ideas to give them that may fit in the vast majority of budgets. And of course, you as a professional, you may want to purchase some ultrasound and give it a shot yourself if you have enough bat work or to justify that particular investment for you. I think it's something definitely worth a try, and then make sure you have something now to offer your clients to get the bats away from loafing at different unwanted areas on their property. Thanks so much for listening. You've been listening to the Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast, where we cover all things related to vertebrate pest management from a research-based perspective. Hope you found this informative for yourself. If you have suggestions, ideas, thoughts, or criticisms of the show, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. And, of course, if you want to be on the show, definitely reach out as well, and we'd love to have you subscribe. Thank you so much for listening, and be safe out there. Until next time, take care, everybody. This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast. Vertebrate pest control is an inherently dangerous activity involving risk of bodily injury to you, others, and or property. Vertebrate pest control also involves legal issues, so be sure to always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods when controlling pests. Wildlife Control Consultant LLC, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their affiliates are not responsible for your use of the information provided here. Always consult a qualified and appropriate professional before employing the information provided here.